So I'm going to be briefly talking about, you know, how do we actually approach groundwater governance? What is groundwater governance? And the whole dialogue around management and governance, management versus governance, looking at it from a groundwater lens. I will try and make it contextual to an urban setting, but this is a more generic groundwater based session that I'm going to basically be talking about. So, before going to anything else, talking about governance, management, I would first like to ask you all, what is groundwater? Uh, you know, there's a lot of people here who have been working on Pune's groundwater, so this is not so much for them, but for the others. This is a very important question because different people have different answers to this question. A farmer would say it's the source of irrigation. Small industries like washing centers will also link it to their livelihoods. Construction industry is looking at it from a negative perspective because of basement flooding and problems during construction. So these are our perceptions of groundwater, but what exactly is groundwater is something that needs to be addressed first and foremost before talking about anything else. So science basically says groundwater is the water which occurs and moves through rocks. That's the established definition of groundwater. So there is a framework of rocks, there is a storage factor, and there is a transmission factor. All these three together define what is groundwater. Now, we all talk about river valley civilizations, India is river valley, vagera, and then when we look at the time frames, we're talking about something like 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. But if we look at groundwater and human civilization, then evidence is now emerging. This is from Cyprus, a dug well. There is a dug well, and during archaeological excavations, they found a skeleton of a girl which was dated back to 10,500 years. So it is now established that groundwater was being used, accessed through a technology called dug wells at least 10 to 11,000 years ago. That's established. Within India also, we have evidences of 4 to 5,000 in the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro sites, the excavations. Recent excavations in Tamil Nadu, which are actually older than Harappa, might give us an even older date in India itself. So, basically, although we are called a river valley civilization all throughout ages, like Shashank sir also said, we have been using groundwater for thousands of years. Now, like I said, it's basically about a framework of rocks. This is the kind of variability that you get within rocks. You saw in the first session the variability within Pune city. Shashank sir mentioned Pashan area. Pashan ha Marathi shabd khadak. But even in that region of Khadak, there are patches where you get, sufficient groundwater. So there is an heterogeneity, there is a variability in rocks when it comes to, the Earth. Earth's history is 4.5 billion years. Our lifetimes, we are talking about a few hundred years. I mean, that's exaggerating. 100 is stretching it too much. And therefore, our perspective of looking at earth sciences and the age of earth sciences, there's a massive disconnect. And there begins the first problem of, what is exploitation? So this variability, if there is so much heterogeneity, variability in rocks, it is obvious you're going to get the same in groundwater because rocks are the hosts for groundwater. And then, you're basically going to get very different kind of scenarios where you'll get very local groundwater storages, from a village perspective, ek gaon ke niche ek storage, or one ward in Pune can have multiple storages or a single groundwater store, etc. So you can have very different kind of groundwater settings in different regions, all dependent on how the rocks are in that region. So all of this background I'm giving because I'm basically coming to this map which Viraj had also shown, which talks about 5 or 6 different colors in India. Now, I'm not limiting this to Pune. I want to talk about India. So India is probably one of the most, diverse countries, not just in cultures and languages, but also in terms of the rocks that are found here. 80% of the identified rocks in the world are observed in India. That's the kind of diversity we have in India, even in rocks. Now, what we at ACWADAM through many years have done is tried and simplified this diversity for, practitioners who aren't really geologists, and club them into 6 or 7 colors, which is this map. This is trying to club rocks based on how groundwater will behave in those rocks. And, then this is basically about ACWADAM. We are a national, now we can say an international think tank, and our whole core is aquifer based groundwater management and governance. We do this through 3 broad heads. First is trainings. Just one slide about ACWADAM, don't worry. Action, research, and decision support. And of course, policy and programs. We don't actively pursue policy programs. We get more pulled into it. We work with people like you all who are sitting here, who work on policy and programs, and we provide the science backing for that. Now, moving on, groundwater, very important perspective. If you look at India's groundwater development, the history, the policies, the laws which have come in, we've basically looked at groundwater just as goods. You have a well, you have a spring, how do we tap it? How do we get most of it? Whether it's crop per drop, improving efficiency through drip, sprinkler, whatever. It's basically looking at groundwater as a resource to be tapped for livelihoods, drinking water, domestics, etc. But groundwater also provides services. Now I know a lot of you here already know that base flow, which is the flow that you get in a river during the non-monsoon, which is almost 8 months of the year in at least in peninsular India, all of that is coming from groundwater. There is a whole cultural significance to this. All the Jyotirlings, I think all of them are based at the origin of a river. The origin of a river is basically a spring. Even in Islam, the holiest site is a dug well. For Zamzam water is nothing but groundwater. So there is a cultural significance, a cultural, religious, social significance also to groundwater. There is a cultural service that groundwater has been providing for thousands of years, along with ecosystem services. This factor of groundwater is not yet given the importance in India as it should be, and as it has been given in, say, some of the other parts, such as the European Union. The South Africa has a fantastic policy on groundwater governance with all of these aspects. We are still scratching the surface on these 2-3 points. Now, given that we've just looked at groundwater as goods, how to extract, there are obvious impacts: depletion of aquifers, drying up of wells. There is obviously water quality issue. Sitting in Pune, we Punekars are very proud people. We keep telling everyone in the country that our water is pristine. No other place in the country can match this kind of water, vagera. But that's basically because upstream of us was very pristine. I'm not sure how the water quality of Pune city supply today compares with, say, 20 years back. I don't think there have been enough studies on that. So, and when it comes to groundwater quality in Pune city, we've in ACWADAM have been trying to do a lot of stuff with Bhujal Abhiyan, but it still needs to go a long way. So that's there. And then the obvious fact of ecosystem services, reduced base flows वगैरह, जिसके ऊपर ज़्यादा बात होती ही नहीं है. Now, there are also impacts which are not very obvious. I'm sorry, I missed a slide. There is a disturbance in equity and justice. I'll basically talk about equity, justice, marginalization of communities towards the end of my session through a couple of stories. But, we see water levels dropping. We experience water quality deteriorating. But the impacts on different communities, different classes are very different. And rapid, haphazard, uncontrolled development actually leads to more inequity than before we brought in, more access to groundwater. Now, Shashank sir spoke about this, but we've just put the map of tier 1, 2 and metropolitan cities of India on the hydrogeological map of India. And you can see that, this basically follows that majority of the urban centers in India fall on the yellow, which is alluvial, river deposits, wind deposits, sand, silt and clay kind of deposits. We are sitting on the green, which is basalts, about which Viraj has spoken about in fair detail. Now, some interesting facts about where we are sitting. If we look at the number of cities by classes, so the first graph is tier 2 cities, then this is tier 1, sorry, this is tier 1, and this here, okay, my cursor is not very visible.
Don't you have a pointer there?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, so tier 2 cities, population less than 50,000. You can see that tier 2 mein the dominant is alluvial, which is again expected. UP, Bihar, Assam, where urban centers are slowly emerging. They haven't yet really fully emerged as much. Tier 1, population of about more than 1 lakh. One is again same, but you can see others also rising thoda sa 1 lakh ke shehron mein. Again, it's dominantly Punjab, Haryana, UP, Bihar types of places. But when we come to metropolitan cities, obviously the number of cities in alluvial again is large because we have the Delhis and Gurgaons. But look at the green. Now, if you go back to this map, you can see the green does not form a large part of the country. The yellow, the pink are the ones which dominate the country. But when you come to the metropolitan cities of our country, the green forms the second highest number of cities. Pune is Bombay, Pune, Mumbai, Indore, Bhopal, part of Bhopal. These are all large metropolitan cities, population more than 10 lakh, which are all falling in the green. The green is what we'll focus on, the basalt rocks which Viraj has spoken about. Now, what we see in that map, if we look at it through a cross section, then this is the kind of variability that you're getting across those 6 different colors. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, but this is just to make you understand that the subsurface across those 6 colors can have such different settings. Now, even without going into the details, just visually you can make out how each of that cartoon is so different. Now, a lot of studies, one specifically from the Center for Science and Environment, has estimated through a survey of 71 cities that half of India's water supply is coming from groundwater. Even in cities like Pune, which has a fairly decent, by national standards, we have a good water supply system. Even in a city like this, the groundwater footprint is as high as almost 50%. Now, having spoken about this kind of a background, now if we also look at what those 6 different, colors mean, say from a availability perspective. So here we have a graph where let's assume that we are looking at 1 hectare of land, and under 1 hectare of land, if there is an aquifer, what is the amount of water that aquifer can potentially store? What is its maximum potential storage under 1 hectare across those 6 different colors in India? Let's compare the alluvial, the yellow and the green. You can see that they are exponentially different. So the kind of storage that you get in aquifers in Pune and the kind of storage that you get in aquifers in Delhi is exponentially different. And therefore, the policies of looking at groundwater management and governance in these different cities of India cannot be a top-down approach. I mean, there has to be some top-level guidance kind of a policy, but the management and governance cannot happen in a top-down because of this natural. You can actually say that it is unfair, but that is how groundwater is. We keep saying at ACWADAM, groundwater is naturally iniquitous. उसमें प्राकृतिक असमानता है. आप जिस जगह पे बैठे हैं वो आपका चॉइस नहीं है. आप जहाँ जन्म हुआ है वो आपका चॉइस नहीं है. बट वहाँ के जो पत्थर और उसका ग्राउंड वाटर अवेलेबिलिटी है, दैट इज बिस्टोर्ड, दैट इज नेचुरल. यू कैनॉट डू एनीथिंग अबाउट इट. किसी भी इंजीनियरिंग टेक्निक से इसको बहुत ज़्यादा चेंज नहीं किया जा सकता. लोकली थोड़ा बहुत इधर उधर ब्लास्टिंग वास्टिंग करते हैं, बट दैट हैज़ माइनर इफेक्ट्स. इट डजंट हैव अ कम्युनिटी लेवल इफेक्ट. सो दिस इज व्हाट वी हैव टू लिव विथ. Now, all our discussion on groundwater happens along this. A dug well, a spring, and a hand pump or a bore well or a tube well. Now, this has largely been a problem of groundwater in India, where we basically talk of bore wells, springs, but these are sources, these are modes through which we access groundwater, जिससे हम पानी निकाल रहे हैं, that is not groundwater itself. And therefore, we need to now move to basically, this has been happening in the last 2 decades, but it needs to happen more rapidly, where we stop talking about sources and we start now talking about the resource, which is groundwater, which brings us to a new word called aquifers. I should have introduced this thoda early. Again, a word which is used a lot nowadays. Last about a decade and a half, aquifers have become very, very common across different thematics, whether it's urban environment में. एक 15 साल पहले एक्विफर रेयरली कोई बात करता था इंडिया में. I mean, I won't go into why it has become so much more popular now, but aquifer is the host of groundwater. Aquifer is the framework of rocks जिसमें groundwater store होता है. It is not, like Shashank sir has also said this very nicely, it's not an empty tank, there's no underground river, it's basically a framework of rocks. वो रॉक में जो ओपनिंग्स है, उस ओपनिंग्स में जो पानी है उसको ग्राउंड वाटर कहते हैं, और उस रॉक के फ्रेमवर्क को एक्विफर कहते हैं. नाउ सो first step is understanding rocks subsurface. Second step is getting to the level of aquifers. Now जब भी ड्राउट आता है, especially in urban India, whenever we are stressed, in a city like Pune, the discussion immediately goes to sugarcane, because we share a dam with others who are dependent on the same dam for livelihoods, for agriculture. So let's try and compare how it looks in, if you bring a common denominator. So if you look at rural Pune district and if you look at urban Pune, so average population of one, say, village is going to be about 1,000. Average population of the administrative unit of Pune urban is around 40 lakhs. Thoda idhar udhar hoga, but let's say, broadly speaking. Average size of the village is going to be about 1,000 hectares, and average size of the urban unit is about 25,000 hectares. Now, density of population 1 and basically 160 for Pune. For Bangalore, because we are also working in Bangalore, 170. Like Virat said, we are talking about 55 LPCD for rural supply, and ये standard government norm है. ये कहाँ से आया, मैंने बहुत कोशिश किया, but I could not find where it has come from, and I've been trying to search for a long time. 55 LPCD is the standard.
Now it's 70 LPC.
Okay, they've increased it. So 70 LPCD for rural water supply, and for urban supply it's 150 LPCD. Now, when you convert it to millimeters, basically what we are doing is dividing by area. So take 55 LPCD को cubic meter में convert करो, तो 20,000 divided by the area, this will give it us in millimeters, just as a common unit for groundwater. So one of the very important issues that we are constantly flagging now is there is no common unit for water. Agriculture वाले हेक्टर्स में लैंड को देखते हैं, लीटर्स या क्यूबिक मीटर्स में पानी को देखते हैं. अर्बन वाले एलपीसीडी में बात करते हैं, इरिगेशन वाले टीएमसी में बात करते हैं. These are all, so trying to bring it, at the moment we are trying to work with millimeters, which is nothing but the water height applied over a unit area. So if we convert the rural and urban water minimum water requirement, which is 70 and 150, it comes to 2 millimeters. अभी 70 हो गया तो शायद 2 का 5 millimeters हो जाएगा. The drinking and domestic water requirement in a village is about 5 millimeters, whereas in a city like Pune, it's about 880 millimeters. Therein is, the answer to the whole sugarcane question. That's one part. The second part is, what is Pune's rainfall? Our water demand at 160 LPCD is 880 millimeters. Pune's average rainfall is what? 650 millimeters, 700 millimeters. So there is a direct disconnect right over there, comparing rainfall and what we are demanding. And now, I am sure this came out from Viraj's presentation, the first presentation, that 876 is what is supplied by the irrigation department. The groundwater usage is over and above this. Is way over and above this. There were figures of something like 400 LPCD is what is Pune's per capita use, per day use. The official figure is 200 or 225 liters per capita. But if you add groundwater to it, it comes to around 400, which means this 876 will actually go way beyond. So we've also tried to do that. If we look at a typical village in this part, Western Maharashtra, Western Ghats, so the water requirement in this typical village is so small that you cannot even see it on this pie chart. Now, if you do the same thing for, say, Pune city, then the human drinking water requirement is about 37 millimeters and the human household domestic requirement is about 1095 millimeters. Rural में वो दोनों मिला के कुछ 2 या 3 मिलीमीटर आएगा. Now, basically 3.5 मिलीमीटर ये गांव का रिक्वायरमेंट है और पुणे शहर का रिक्वायरमेंट है 1100 मिलीमीटर. So, I mean, forget the urban versus rural, agriculture versus urban part. Right now, let's not even talk about it. Right now, let's just focus on the fact that both of these are typical basalt systems, Pune city and Western Maharashtra, and a basalt aquifer can typically hold only about maximum 150 millimeter. अगर बसाल्ट के एक्विफर का भी स्टोरेज कैपेसिटी आप निकालो तो वो 50 से 150 मिलीमीटर पे आएगा और उसके सामने अवर रिक्वायरमेंट इवन अगर रूरल का अगर हम टोटल रिक्वायरमेंट करें it's still coming to around 500 millimeters. 500 millimeters against an aquifer of 50 to 150 millimeters for villages. For urban, we are talking about something like 1300, 1400 millimeters with an aquifer of the same storage. The aquifer is a common denominator. Aquifer doesn't change. It cannot change. Not in our lifetimes. 4.5 billion years of the Earth's evolution. It's going to take another 1,000 million years for the geology to show any significant change. So, basically trying to use density of people per unit of land as a common unit. So, use 1 hectare, which is what we saw in that graph, and then try and plot the annual water demand as with 1 hectare of land as the common factor, where you can see here that this is your annual water demand in millimeters per hectare. Okay, because agricultural water demand is calculated in millimeters per hectare. A rice crop requires some 1500 millimeters of water. Sugarcane requires some 700 to 1100 millimeters of water. That's how we look at water in agriculture. So why not try and look at water in a similar way even in urban settings? So as your density of people per hectare of land increases, you can see the rise in water demand is also exponential. So from a rural to an urban setting where we have a very high density of people packed in a very small area, the water demand has also grown exponentially. Now, yeah.
This is not per capita, right?
No.
This is
Aggregated. This is aggregated to a hectare. So the unit is per hectare. It's no more per capita. So yeah. So basically that's the point. Try and move away from per capita to per hectare. Just because all other water users are looked at per hectare. Only urban we are looking at say per capita kind of because that's a supply side unit. If we are trying to come to a management and governance kind of a unit, we probably need to come to some common unit. Now, this is what we are trying. There could be other ways to do it also. But if we are to look at water as one at the state level, at the city level, then we need to also bring into units as one.
It's the intensity of water use per hectare.
Correct. Rainfall is in millimeters and all our hydrological cycle, all of us in school have been taught hydrological cycle, it always begins with rainfall. We don't agree completely with that, but that's another topic. Now, the first response to this kind of a situation is basically recharge. Too much of dependence on groundwater is happening, vagera. Now, I won't deal too much about this because Shashank sir has actually used he's put words in our mouth that it's not simply pushing water into a bore well. It is, there has to be an aquifer perspective to recharge. So again, I won't go into too much detail. This is all which Shashank sir has already spoken about. But managed aquifer recharge is a new term which has been used for artificial recharge. थोड़ा सा refine किया गया है. And this is something that we need to look at different scales. So, when we talk of scales, we are looking at, say, river basins, micro watersheds, or, a structure. Like he said, there is a check dam. That is a structure meant for recharge. Or your society's, rooftop rainwater harvesting, which is recharging a borewell. That is a structure for recharge. You can look at recharge at that scale, and you have to look at recharge at an aquifer scale. And there are these questions which are very important. Where are you recharging? Without an aquifer perspective, there is no meaning to your recharge. You're just doing it blindly. It's basically an inefficient way of investing time and money, because one doesn't know where that water is going. It could recharge, it could not recharge. So where? Which aquifer? Is that the important aquifer? South aquifers are very thin. How much water can they take in? So what is the capacity of the aquifer? What is its current storage? Will it take in the kind of water which we are public, mandated recharge? Very good, noble idea. But do our aquifers have the capacity to take in water from all of the rooftops in the city? That's a question which needs to be, again, because it's linked to investments, it's linked to time, it's linked to area, etc. All of that. And how do you recharge? Mohammadwadi, there is a check dam which is recharging. An old check dam which is being revived and used. Sadashivpet, probably a borewell, a point source injection. So how you recharge also becomes important. Pashan, older areas, they have these pits of 6 feet which are supposed to recharge. It's Pashan, it's hard rock. In one rain the pit gets full and it's just flowing on the surface. It's not recharging. So how, where and how much are very important questions when it comes to rainwater harvesting. Another example would be Yeroda, or the Aga Khan Palace के आसपास जो area है, there's basement flooding. You can't do shallow recharge there. Lakshmi Narayan Talkies, basement flooding. You can't do recharge, shallow aquifer recharge there. So it becomes important to bring in a perspective, which brings us to this kind of a question where ACWADAM has not just demarcated aquifers, we've also tried to map out the land use or the type of built up on that aquifer recharge area, and therefore we are asking whether we can move away from mandated recharge, individual level or society level, to public recharge. Like, there were hints in Viraj's session where we spoke about PMC taking it up in parks, in roads. Yes, that's at the PMC level. But can we not think about investing as a community, as an urban community, in the recharge areas instead of doing it random and haphazard everywhere and anywhere? So that's a question we'd like to leave you with. A new mission statement. I didn't emphasize this enough earlier, but shallow aquifers as against deeper. The reason I didn't, because Shashank sir has spent a significant amount of time on this. It has always been shallow aquifers throughout the world. Borewells came in only as, it was a reaction to droughts and famines. That was not a arrangement which was supposed to continue all throughout. It came in as a reaction, as a safety against, as a buffer. It was not meant to proliferate the way it has. We need to protect our shallow aquifers because they provide, per unit aquifer area or per unit aquifer volume, your shallow aquifer is going to provide you much more water than a deeper aquifer. Your rivers rejuvenation पे आज बहुत काम हो रहा है, साधु संत पे भी उस पे बात कर रहे हैं. Unless you start talking about groundwater, you cannot talk about river rejuvenation. Like I said, base flow, मूल प्रवाह, हिंदी में मूल, foundation, core. The core flow of a river is nothing but groundwater. which is coming and seeping through over 8 months. So if you don't bring in an aquifer perspective and a shallow aquifer perspective into your national vision on river rejuvenation, nothing is going to happen other than, say, maybe riverfront development. So yeah, हेरिटेज पे बहुत संस्थाएं हैं जो अच्छा काम कर रही है इंडिया में. Aquifers as heritage which has been passed on to us. I mean the natural heritage of the rock formation which has been passed on since billions of years. That's one. And second, wells as heritage. Like I said, if we have been using a technology since 11,000 years and it has remained unchanged, the dug well, if it has remained unchanged since 11,000 years, largely unchanged, diameter change hua hai, size change hua hai, but the technology itself has not changed, then we need to think about ancient versus modern technologies. The dug well as a heritage, and India has just the kind of dug wells that we have throughout this country. Step wells ke bare mein sabne suna hai, Bowdies. Pune, unfortunately, it doesn't have too many, but very close we have this Kutli Vihir. गावाचंच नाव विहीर आहे. Limb. What is that well called? Baramotechi. 12 irrigation pumps of that time used to run at the same time. Now that is heritage. The owner has preserved that heritage. Just the way that well is constructed. What happens when water level falls? How do you access water at different times of the season? This was all built into that technology. So is it really obsolete? Is that technology which is sustained and remained unchanged, is that obsolete? So that as heritage. And then build policy basically through improved research. Yes, we still do need a lot of research around especially urban groundwater and move away from a top-down approach. Now, I'd like to come to this slide where again Shashank sir has mentioned this, but I'll just still make this. Recharge is not a magic wand, as Dr. Kulkarni always says. There is a limit to the aquifer storage. So our problems of groundwater depletion are not just going to be solved by recharge. Yes, it is important. Yes, it has its all other pros and cons, but there is a demand line which keeps rising, and no matter how much and how well you recharge, at some point of time in the near future, we are going to cross the aquifer limits, the combined aquifer limits, and therefore, we need to really rethink not just recharge but also demand. We need to look at demand as an urban community. So therefore, recharge and all, I can sense her looking at time, so I'm going to skip a little bit. When it comes to groundwater management, ACWADAM has been leading a program for almost now 1.5-2 decades called participatory groundwater management. Now this program has some principles. These principles have roots in some phenomenal work done by phenomenal experts in the past. One is Elinor Ostrom and her Tragedy of Commons. But even before her research came out, there was Dr. Vilasrao Salunke and the Pani Panchayat model. Look at Pani Panchayat and look at Elinor Ostrom's work, it's more or less matching. Only thing, Pani Panchayat model was much before its time. So what are these principles? The first and foremost, groundwater or aquifers as common pool resource. Now, I will be talking about a little about governance after this, but it's important that we are talking about this. Common pool resource, generally जब बात करते हैं तो हम लोग गांव में जाके बात करेंगे कि ये आपका कुआं मतलब आपका पानी नहीं है. Right? Water is common. But this also applies to the government or, say the groundwater cell that the Pune Municipal Corporation has set up. That there is no owner of it. The government also doesn't own. So there is a whole public trust doctrine that applies to groundwater. The government doesn't own groundwater resources. Like, it puts ownership on, say, other minerals like coal and petroleum. Groundwater as a common pool resource has implications not just on the users, but also on those who are trying to govern it. They are supposed to treat it as a public trust rather than an ownership perspective. So first is that it is a common pool resource. Then there has to be an aquifer perspective to anything and everything that you do on groundwater. Without aquifers, we really can't do much. And then there are other points. Right now, I won't go into details. Now, then we basically come to, from management, we start moving towards groundwater governance. And there are some very nice definitions of governance. This is one of the best, where I'm just going to read out the key words: responsibility, participation, information availability, transparency, custom, and rule of law. Please note, rule of law comes last. Yes, it is important, but only rule of law cannot solve your groundwater problems. So, groundwater governance can be better thought of as aquifer governance or governance of aquifers, because the unit for governing groundwater has to be aquifers. You can begin at a ward level or a village in a gram panchayat, because that's the scale that is most easiest to start with, but eventually it has to be all collated to an aquifer level. In Pune, maybe our wards have multiple aquifers. That is also possible. But basically, whatever scale is practical to begin work with, but eventually lead to aquifers. Now, so just to summarize the previous definition: transparency, participation, information, rule of law, all of this is part of a process. So this is the process of going towards groundwater governance. Very important. Viraj mentioned in the beginning that we need information. We need this group here to generate more information, to mobilize people to generate. Shashank sir said we need this group to put pressure, peer pressure on the government. Now, this pressure has to be dependent on information which also comes from the same group. This is the process that we are trying to achieve through these meetings and through Bhujal Abhiyan. Administrative action and decision making is an art, a very difficult art, which unfortunately I think most of us agree we haven't done well with. And there has to be a balance between protection and moderation. So we are not here saying that don't use this, don't use at all, don't use borewells, springs ko haath mat laga. We are not saying that. We are saying try and find that balance. It's very difficult to find the perfect balance. Practically feasible jitna possible hai, protection and use mein jitna bhi balance possible hai wo karo. In India, there is a serious need to quickly bring in reforms in policy and practice. We've been part of a lot of these attempts in which Dr. Kulkarni has been a member of many committees of many reforms that have been proposed, but those things are not happening. Now, if you look at groundwater governance, and abhi tak maine jo baat ki about how it basically should be, when everything should be looked at an aquifer scale, then your national groundwater governance ka policy should look something like this, where at the national level there is only an overall monitoring and a policy guideline such as the groundwater model bill. At the state level you have the water policy, because state is assumed to be a state, water is assumed to be a state subject. I say assumed, sir, because the constitution clearly states center has the right to intervene when the states are not doing well on water. The constitution clearly says this, but the center obviously ignores it for political reasons. It's easier to say state kuch nahi kar raha hai, unka kaam hai. But our constitution has the provision. So water policy, energy, irrigation and an urban water policy is the state's mandate. At the local level, since we are in the city, our municipal corporation, the urban ULBs as they are called now, convergence with various programs, bahut sare program aa rahe hain. At the rural, Gram Sabha and Panchayat should be strengthened. Urban may we look at wards and how ward members can be strengthened to take decisions. And finally, it has to lead to some kind of an aquifer based groundwater management. All of this governance framework, uska aim is aquifer ke scale pe groundwater ko manage karna for both sustainability and basic sustenance and livelihoods. Now, there have been some promising shifts. So 1970s के 80s में groundwater development पे ज़्यादा ये हुआ था, focus हुआ था, because at that time we needed more access and better agriculture and वगैरह वगैरह. So we focused more on extraction and finding groundwater. 1990s 2000s is where we realized that we need to also recharge and conserve, and the whole environmental boom ये जो हुआ था 90s के बाद conservation पे, तो the whole watershed movement which came about especially in rural parts. And then we have रेगुलेशन की बात होने लगी है अभी, वेयर महाराष्ट्र अगेन पायनियर स्टेट. प्लीज नोट, हम लोग ये रूम में बैठ के बहुत गवर्नमेंट पे हंस रहे हैं, ये कर रहे हैं, बट अक्रॉस इंडिया व्हेन इट कम्स टू ग्राउंड वाटर, महाराष्ट्र इज द फोरमोस्ट स्टेट अक्रॉस. व्हेनेवर वी टॉक टू CGWB, वो लोग बोलते हैं यार आपका GSDA हमको बताता है काम कैसे करें. Despite all the problems, we are still, we have set the benchmarks for the rest of the country. So we are the first to have an act on managing and governing groundwater. But of course, a lot needs to be done. This is just a list of the different Government of India programs which are available for convergence. So, for example, this Amrut 2, which is a program for reviving shallow aquifers, जिसमें भूजल अभियान ने कुछ पायलट साइट्स को चुन के वहाँ पे डगवेल्स को रिवाइव करने का काम अभी शुरू है. So, what do we need to get to this kind of a framework? We need good data-driven decisions. उसके लिए we need better groundwater assessments. अभी का जो assessment है, we are not saying they are wrong, we are just saying they are not good enough because of various problems. And bring in a very strong aspect of groundwater quality, which is currently not as well pursued as it should be, especially in urban setting. Like sir mentioned, lead आया है, unofficially mention किया है, but किया है. lead आया है, क्यों आया, कहाँ आया, is anyone testing? Let's forget the government. There are some 7,000 civil society organizations in Pune, official government data. So I think along with dams, we have the highest density of civil society organizations. So are we also looking at water quality from different perspectives, such as pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, वगैरह वगैरह. So that's just addressing. So ये मैंने एक बात की थी इक्विटी, फेयरनेस एंड जस्टिस की. इस पे मैं छोटा 2 कहानी के बारे में बताऊंगा. स्पेशली पुणे में हम बैठे हैं तो ये बहुत ज़रूरी है समझना. We are talking about this region, Western Maharashtra, where the upper reaches. Now, ये जो distance है, this is about say 200 kilometers, okay? जो पहाड़ है, they are dominantly tribals. All across Western Maharashtra, आप जाइए पुणे में मुर्शी के ऊपर पहाड़ों में जाइए. It's basically tribals. I mean, Murshi is a bad example because all the land is sold. But say if you go to Ozar, Lenyadri, those parts, it's still tribals in the top. Then come to the foothills is where the large irrigation structures are. Even our Temgar and Panshet. The tribals are actually providing an ecosystem services by conserving the land on top, which is providing water to these dams and keeping the water pristine, of which we are very proud. Where does this water go? The water is actually coming here where it's dominantly non-tribals, urban centers like Pune, and also agriculture, not just urban. There's also the agricultural community, which is also non-tribal. There is an emerging conflict. There is an obvious competition, but there is also an emerging conflict जो न्यूज़ में तभी आएगा जब ड्राउट आएगा. This, and it keeps happening, like विराज ने जो मेंशन किया कि येरवडा को अभी पानी खड़कवासला से नहीं आ रहा है, भामा आस्केड से आ रहा है. Farmers in Bhama Asked have actually started, the local politician there actually forces the irrigation department to release water for irrigation when it is not scheduled to be released. Now the argument there is, पुणे को दे रहे हो, हमको क्यों नहीं दे रहे हो, हमारा तो पेट चलता है, whatever. This kind of a conflict has started to emerge and it keeps happening, and it's going to get worse because we have exhausted all the water sources that were there. Another story from Madhya Pradesh where ऊपर के किसान बड़े थे, नीचे के किसान ट्राइबल थे. नीचे सबसिस्टेंस फार्मिंग मतलब बेसिक घर पे खाने के लिए जो मिलेट्स विलेट्स उगाते थे, ज़्यादा ग्राउंड वाटर डेवलपमेंट नहीं था. ऊपर लार्ज फार्मर्स, एक्सेस टू गवर्नमेंट प्रोग्राम्स, पॉलिसीज. स्लोली उनका पानी खत्म हो गया. इवेंचुअली आई एम स्किपिंग सम स्टेप्स, बट इवेंचुअली पानी खत्म हो गया. नेक्स्ट स्टेप ऑफ एक्सप्लॉयटेशन इज they come down to the plains to the tribal lands, and वहाँ ट्राइबल्स को लमसम 1 साल का पैसा दे देंगे, तुम्हारा ज़मीन हमने रेंट पे ले लिया, and then they will grow their cash super water intensive crops. Now, what that does to the tribals, yes, they get a secured income, but उनका पीने का पानी खत्म होने लग गया है. This kind of especially this story, पुणे में अगर देखो, हमारा पेरी अर्बन एरिया से हमारा पानी आ रहा है टैंकर से. अभी a lot of those peri urban we have actually got assimilated. How many new villages were added to the PMC? Now we are going to go beyond that for water. The unorganized, so-called unorganized, I don't believe it's unorganized, but the water which is coming in is actually going to lead to some kind of a competition like this between irrigation and drinking water for the urban societies. So therefore, ये जो पिछला 2 स्टोरी बताया उसमें आपका इक्विटी एंड जस्टिस का सारा कहानी है. I won't get into too much details about it now. And then basically decentralized, democratized groundwater governance. Pune mein it has been a fantastic attempt where societies and welfare boards have got together and worked with the PMC to set up a groundwater cell. A long way to go, but ये सारा हुआ है because there has been some kind of information and data generation at the scale which is important. ये हिमांशु सर, डॉक्टर कुलकर्णी का एक ये है कि there are 7 P's for governance of aquifers. Principles, जिसकी हमने बात की, ग्राउंड वाटर मैनेजमेंट के कुछ प्रिंसिपल्स होते हैं, out of which the core is common pool resource. People, human behavior, of course, tensions, competition and conflict. For example, थोड़ा radical thought है, मेरा thought नहीं है लेकिन मैं रखना चाहूँगा. लोगों का behavior के बारे में अगर एक इसके पहले सेशन में, फर्स्ट सेशन में बात हो रही थी about hills. Someone from the construction industry had attended our 15-day training on groundwater, and at the end of the training this person said that, look, I'm in the business, I have to be in the business to survive. So ये hilltops का जो है, which you are saying they are recharge areas, why don't you lobby with the PMC and say that वहाँ FSI एक ही रहेगा? Make it a premium kind of a zone where you will get only one FSI so that the construction is limited and therefore recharge के लिए potential ज़्यादा है. I'm not saying that this is not, therefore I said these are not my thoughts. I'm just saying people's behavior and approach to different issues is going to be very different and often radical. So it's very important to understand that when talking about governing aquifers. Competition and conflict के ऊपर ग्राउंड वाटर का जो कंपटीशन है वो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट बहुत रेयरली बनता है बिकॉज वी डोंट हैव अ परसेप्शन ऑफ ग्राउंड वाटर बीइंग कॉमन. तो झगड़ा नहीं दिखेगा बट कंपटीशन बहुत हो रहा है. वी ऑल नो मेरा नेबर 300 फीट किया तो मैं 350 करूंगा, 400 करूंगा. दैट्स बेसिकली इनहेरेंट कंपटीशन. Processes, we've already spoken about this. They have to be participatory and collaborative, like with Bhujal, Abhiyan. All of the data most of the data that has gone into these reports has been collected in a participatory collaborative mode. Practices, so community को action लेना आना चाहिए, decisions लेने चाहिए, and policies basically move away from command and control. This is more for the governing authority. And then the last 2 P's are basically plurality. Plurality can be viewed in different perspectives, but and partnership. Just as here, this report is a classic example of partnership between so many entities. I mean, I won't go into the names right now, but academics hai, civil society hai, and activists hai. I mean, there are 2 kinds of civil societies. One which is focusing on research and action research and bringing out data, generating data. There's another civil society which is working in an activist mode. Both are important. Both need to work together, and that's how that report has basically come out. Yeah, thank you.